The morning the bride arrived, the town was already awake with gossip. Dust rolled through the narrow frontier street like drifting memory, curling around wooden porches and faded signs that had seen too many seasons. Horses stamped impatiently outside the small church where the marriage papers had been arranged, not with celebration, but with necessity. There was no music, no cheering crowd, only the uneasy silence of people pretending not to stare. She stood at the edge of the steps, holding her worn leather bag tightly against her side. Her dress was simple, stitched from practical fabric, meant for travel rather than beauty. Still, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, as if refusing to let circumstance decide who she was. She had been sent here by decisions made far away, decisions she never agreed to, but had no power to refuse. The letter had been clear. This marriage would secure safety, land, and survival. Her name had been signed long before she ever saw the man she was meant to marry. And yet, when she finally lifted her eyes toward him, she realized nothing about this situation felt like safety. He stood apart from the crowd, the Apache warrior. He did not dress like the townsmen. He did not shift nervously or whisper to neighbors. He did not even pretend to belong. His presence was still, grounded, and unreadable, like a mountain that had never learned how to move for anyone. His hair fell long and dark against his shoulders, tied back in a way that felt practical rather than decorative. His eyes, however, were what unsettled her most. They were not cold, nor warm, but distant in a way that suggested he had already lived through too many beginnings that ended in loss. People in town spoke of him in fragments. A man who had survived wars, a man who did not stay in one place for long, a man who trusted no one. And now, somehow, he was her husband. The priest cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the tension between them. Words were spoken, formal, mechanical, rushed, the kind of ceremony that tried to disguise uncertainty as tradition. Her attention remained fixed on the man across from her, trying to understand how fate had placed her here, standing beside someone who felt both real and unreachable at the same time. When it was over, there was no applause, only the sound of wind pressing through wooden beams and the faint creak of old boards beneath shifting feet. Someone muttered congratulations that sounded more like relief than joy. Then the crowd began to disperse, and just like that, she was alone with him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them felt heavier than distance alone could explain. It was not just physical space. It was history, culture, pain, and everything neither of them had asked to carry into this moment. She tightened her grip on her bag. "I didn't have a choice," she said at last, her voice low but steady. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if weighing the truth of her words against his own experience of forced paths. His expression did not change much, but something in his gaze softened, not into kindness exactly, but into recognition. "I know," he said simply. That was all. No anger, no comfort, just understanding. He turned slightly, gesturing for her to follow him. The townspeople watched as they walked away from the church, side by side, but not together in any meaningful sense. The house he led her to stood at the edge of town, where the land began to open into dry plains and wind-carved silence. It was modest, isolated, and surrounded by emptiness that stretched farther than she was used to seeing. Inside, the air smelled of wood, smoke, and something older, something like solitude that had settled into the walls over time. She set her bag down carefully, unsure of where she belonged in a space that already felt claimed by absence. He did not rush her. He did not explain anything. Instead, he simply removed his coat, placed it on a hook, and moved as if giving her time to decide what she wanted to do with herself. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He did not force space. He did not demand closeness. He simply existed, and allowed her to do the same. But that silence carried weight too. It made her aware of every breath, every movement, every uncertainty she had tried to bury beneath duty and survival. She had expected cruelty, or at least indifference shaped into sharpness. Instead, she found restraint, something far more difficult to read. Outside, the wind pressed against the house like an unspoken question. Inside, the bride stood at the threshold of a life she did not choose, looking at a man she did not understand, realizing that survival here would not come from escape, but from learning what kind of silence she had just stepped into. Night arrived slowly over the plains, as if even darkness hesitated to fully claim the land. The wind softened, but never truly stopped, brushing against the wooden house in steady, patient waves. Inside, the fire burned low, casting uneven light across the room, stretching shadows along the walls, and making everything feel larger than it was. The bride sat near the far side of the room, where she had placed her small bag earlier. She hadn't unpacked it. Not yet. It felt like doing so would mean acceptance, and she wasn't ready to decide what she was accepting. Across from her, the Apache warrior sat close to the fire, elbows resting loosely on his knees. He was not watching the flames the way most people did, with distraction or comfort. He watched them as if they were speaking a language only he understood, one built from memory, heat, and survival. The silence between them was not empty. It was layered. Every crackle of wood felt louder than it should have. Every shift of wind outside felt like a reminder that the world beyond this house still existed, still moved, still judged. She studied him carefully when she thought he wasn't looking. He was not what the town had implied. There was no arrogance in his posture, no cruelty in his expression. Instead there was restraint. Careful, practiced restraint, like someone who had learned that stillness was safer than reaction. His hands rested loosely, but she noticed the subtle tension in them, as if he was always aware of what they could do, and choosing not to let them decide anything. Eventually, he spoke. Not loudly, not abruptly, just enough to break the silence without shattering it. "You should rest," he said. It wasn't an order. It wasn't even a suggestion that demanded obedience. It was simply a statement, as though he understood exhaustion as something inevitable between them. She didn't answer immediately. Rest felt impossible in a place where everything was unfamiliar. The walls, the silence, the man across from her, and the life she had been pushed into without consent. Instead, she asked the question that had been sitting inside her since the ceremony. "Why did you agree to this?" Her voice was steady, but there was something fragile underneath it. Something that could break if the answer was wrong. He didn't look surprised. That was the first thing she noticed, as if he had expected her to ask. He leaned back slightly, eyes still on the fire. "I didn't agree," he said. "I accepted what was placed in front of me." That answer did not comfort her. It made the room feel even smaller. She hugged her arms lightly, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. "So we're both just trapped?" For the first time, his gaze shifted toward her fully. Not sharply, not intrusively, but with a kind of quiet attention that made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. "I don't see it that way," he said after a pause. The fire popped softly, sending a small spark upward. She waited, unsure if he would continue. When he did, his voice was lower than before. "There are things people cannot choose," he said, "but they can still choose how they act inside them." The words lingered. She didn't respond right away, because she didn't know how. The idea felt foreign to her, choice existing inside constraint. Her life until now had been defined by decisions made by others: family, contracts, survival. Choice had always been something distant, something other people were allowed to have. But he spoke as if it was still possible here. As if even this situation, strange and forced as it was, contained some small space for agency. The fire burned lower again, the room dimming slightly. He reached for a small cup near him, then paused, glancing at her once more. When he spoke again, his tone shifted, not softer but more careful. "If you are afraid," he said, "you do not have to hide it. The words struck differently than anything else he had said, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, honest. She looked away first, not because she was angry, but because she didn't trust what her expression might reveal. Fear was not something she had been allowed to show freely in her life. It had always been something to manage, suppress, or disguise as strength. "I'm not afraid," she said automatically. But the pause that followed betrayed her. He noticed. Of course he did. Still, he didn't challenge her. He didn't press her into contradiction. He just nodded slightly, as if accepting both her words and the truth behind them. Then he surprised her. He shifted slightly closer to the fire and spoke again, but this time his voice was quieter, almost like a confession meant for the space between them rather than her directly. "Stop me when it's too much." The sentence hung in the air, longer than any sound before it. She frowned slightly, uncertain. "What do you mean?" He didn't look at her this time. He kept his eyes on the flames. "It means," he said, "you are not something to be taken, not here, not by me. If this life becomes something you cannot bear, you speak. I will listen." The simplicity of it made it feel even more unreal. There was no demand in his words, no hidden pressure, only an offering, strange, unexpected, and disarming. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the house again, as if testing its boundaries. Inside, she sat in silence, trying to understand a man who had just given her something she had not been given in a long time. Not control, not comfort, but permission to speak. Morning came pale and uncertain, slipping through the thin cracks of the wooden shutters like hesitant light. The bride woke before the fire had fully died, her body stiff from sleeping in a place that still didn't feel like hers. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the silence of the house returned to her, the same heavy quiet, the same unfamiliar walls, the same life waiting outside her thoughts. The Apache warrior was already awake. He sat near the doorway, not close to her, not far either, just positioned in a way that suggested awareness of everything without trying to dominate any of it. The early light touched his profile, outlining the strong lines of his face, the calm discipline in his posture. He was sharpening a small blade, slow and deliberate, each motion controlled like it had been practiced 1,000 times in silence. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "You don't sleep much," she said softly. He didn't look up immediately. "I sleep enough." That was all. She pushed herself up, adjusting her dress slightly, suddenly aware of how unprepared she felt for even basic existence here. There was no routine she understood yet, no familiarity to hold on to. Everything felt like learning to breathe in a new language. After a pause, she asked the question that had been circling her mind since the night before. "Who are you?" This time, he stopped sharpening. The blade paused mid-motion, catching the light. For a moment, she thought he might not answer at all. Instead, he set the blade down carefully and leaned back slightly, as if the question required more space than the room could offer. "I am someone who has been left behind," he said. It was not dramatic, not emotional in the way stories often were. It was factual. That made it heavier. Left behind by who? His gaze shifted briefly toward the open doorway, where the land stretched out, dry, endless, quiet. "People I trusted," he said simply, "and people who never saw me as I was." The words didn't invite pity. They didn't even sound like accusation. They sounded like something that had already been accepted long ago, like an injury that had stopped bleeding but never fully healed. She studied him more carefully now. There was something in his stillness that was not natural peace. It was learned control, the kind that comes after chaos, after loss, after realizing that reacting too strongly only leads to more damage. She sat down slowly across from him, not too close. "What happened to you?" she asked. For a moment, he didn't answer. The wind outside shifted, brushing against the house with a low, distant sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "There was a time I believed belonging was simple," he said. "That if I did what was right, I would be accepted. That if I protected people, they would not turn away." He paused, fingers resting loosely near the table. "I was wrong." The simplicity of those words carried a history she could not see, but could feel pressing against them. She didn't interrupt. He continued, slower now. "I learned that loyalty does not always mean safety, and trust does not always mean protection." A long silence followed. Inside that silence, she began to understand something important, not about him, but about the space between them. It wasn't empty. It was filled with things neither of them had said yet. Pain, hesitation, memory. She looked down at her hands. "I think I understand that," she said quietly. "More than I want to." That made him look at her again. Not sharply, but with a tension that felt deeper than before. "You?" he asked. She exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much truth she could safely carry into the open. "I was not chosen either," she said. "Not really. I was placed, arranged, moved like it didn't matter what I felt." Her voice didn't break, but it softened. "I learned early that my voice didn't change outcomes, only decisions others had already made." The Apache warrior listened without interruption. That was what surprised her most. He didn't dismiss her experience, he didn't compare it to his own. He simply allowed it to exist. Outside, a bird called briefly, before disappearing into the wind. Inside, something shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that the air between them felt less like distance and more like shared recognition. Two people shaped by systems they didn't control. Two lives built on decisions made elsewhere. She looked up at him again. "Is that why you are like this?" she asked. "Quiet? Careful?" He considered the question for a long moment. Then he said, "It is one reason." A pause. "There are others." She nodded slightly, not pressing further. For once, she understood that some truths weren't ready to be spoken all at once. The blade remained untouched now, resting on the table like something momentarily forgotten. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees again, eyes steady but distant. "I do not expect you to understand me quickly," he said, "or trust this place. Or me." His voice lowered just slightly. "But I will not force you to become something you are not." That sentence settled into her more deeply than anything else he had said. Because it wasn't about him. It was about her. And for the first time since arriving, she felt something unfamiliar. Not safety, not comfort, but the beginning of space. Space to exist without being reshaped immediately. Outside, the land remained unchanged, wide, indifferent, endless. But inside the house, two people who had both been left behind in different ways began quietly to recognize that survival might not only be about enduring pain, but understanding the walls it builds around the heart. The storm arrived without warning. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted from pale blue to a heavy, bruised gray, as if the horizon itself had begun to sink under the weight of something unspoken. The wind that had once been distant now pressed hard against the house, rattling the shutters and sending thin streams of dust sliding across the porch. Inside, the air felt tighter. The bride stood near the window, watching the world blur as rain began to fall in uneven sheets. She had never seen storms like this before, wide, open, unprotected. Back home, storms came and went quickly, contained by buildings and streets. Here, the storm felt like it had nowhere else to go, except everything. Behind her, the Apache warrior moved quietly. He was securing loose wood at the door, checking the edges of the roof with practiced awareness, as if the storm was not an interruption, but something to be accounted for. His movements were steady, efficient, without urgency, but never careless. She turned slightly, "Does it always get this bad?" she asked. He glanced up briefly. "Sometimes worse." That was all he said before returning to his task. The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than any dramatic explanation could have. It made the storm feel less like an event, and more like a recurring truth of this land. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by wind and rain. Then, unexpectedly, a loud crack echoed outside. One of the outer supports had loosened. Without hesitation, he moved toward the door. "You should stay inside," he said, already pulling his coat tighter. "I'm not fragile," she replied, before she could stop herself. That made him pause, just for a moment. Not enough to argue, not enough to soften, but enough to acknowledge her words. "Then stay close," he said, and he stepped outside. The cold hit immediately. Rain soaked into everything, his hair, his shoulders, the ground beneath his feet. The world beyond the door was no longer land and sky, but motion and noise. She hesitated only a second before following him out, pulling her shawl tighter around herself. He noticed instantly. "You didn't listen," he said without turning fully. "I didn't disobey," she corrected. "I chose." That earned the faintest shift in his expression. Not approval, not irritation, but recognition. They worked together in silence. He held the broken beam steady while she handed him tools from inside the doorway. At first, their coordination was awkward, uncertain. She didn't know what mattered, what didn't. He didn't explain more than necessary. But slowly, something began to form between them. Not conversation, but rhythm. A shared focus, a shared urgency. At one point, the wind pushed harder than before, nearly knocking her off balance. Instinctively, he reached out and steadied her by the arm. It was brief, controlled, but it lingered in the space between them longer than the touch itself. She looked at him. He let go immediately, as if realizing the significance of what he had done. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. But neither of them moved away faster than necessary. The storm continued to rage, but something inside the house, and between them, had shifted slightly. When they finally secured the beam and stepped back inside, both were wet, breathing harder, grounded in the reality of effort shared rather than distance maintained. He closed the door behind them, leaning against it for a moment. The silence returned, but it was different now, less heavy, more aware. She wiped rain from her face, watching him as he checked the damage once more, making sure everything would hold. Then, without thinking too much about it, she spoke. "You don't talk much when things go wrong," she said. He glanced at her. "I act," he replied simply. That made her exhale, a small, almost reluctant sound that might have been a laugh if she had allowed it to fully form. "I noticed," she said. A pause. Then, more quietly, she added, "It's strange. I feel like I'm supposed to be afraid of you, but I'm not." That made him stop completely. For the first time since the storm began, he fully turned toward her. Outside, the wind howled again, but inside, everything seemed to pause for a fraction of a moment. "People usually are," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why it's strange." He studied her for a long moment, not in judgment, not in calculation, but in something closer to uncertainty, as if he was trying to understand how something he had accepted about himself could suddenly be questioned by someone who had every reason to believe it. "I don't want you to be afraid of me," he said finally. The honesty of it was quiet, almost reluctant. She nodded slightly. "I don't think I could be," she admitted. That admission changed nothing on the surface, and yet everything beneath it, because for the first time, distance between them was no longer just space. It was something being tested. Outside, the storm continued its roar. Inside, two people stood in a house that no longer felt entirely divided, realizing that trust does not begin with closeness, but with the first moment someone chooses not to step away. The morning after the storm carried a strange stillness. The land outside looked washed clean. though not softened. The rain had passed, but it left behind a world sharpened by moisture, brighter dust, heavier air, and puddles that reflected the sky like broken pieces of a different life. The house stood intact, but not unchanged. Something in it felt more lived in now, as if the storm had pressed the walls closer together and forced everything inside to acknowledge its fragility. The bride noticed it immediately. So did he. The Apache warrior moved through the space with his usual quiet precision, checking what needed repair, what needed attention. But there was a difference now, subtle, almost invisible. He no longer moved as though she were simply a presence to be accommodated. There was a faint awareness of her in his rhythm, as if she had become part of the space he accounted for. She didn't know what to do with that. Outside, distant voices broke the quiet. At first they were faint, carried by wind, then becoming clearer as hooves approached. 3 riders emerged along the edge of the land, moving slowly but deliberately toward the house. The bride stiffened. He noticed before she spoke. "Stay inside," he said immediately. Her gaze stayed fixed on the riders. "Who are they?" He didn't answer right away. That silence told her enough. "They know you," she guessed. A pause. "Yes," he said finally. The tone in his voice changed, not louder, but lower, more contained. The riders stopped near the edge of the property, not dismounting immediately. One of them called out, voice sharp and carrying. "Is this how you live now?" the man shouted. "With outsiders?" The bride felt something tighten in her chest. The Apache warrior stepped outside without hesitation. No rush, just presence. But it was enough to shift the air. The riders dismounted slowly. The lead man was older, his face hardened by time and resentment. His eyes flicked briefly toward the bride standing in the doorway, before returning to him. "You brought her here?" the man asked. "After everything?" The Apache didn't respond immediately. "I did not bring her," he said finally. "She is here because of decisions made without either of us." The second rider scoffed. "That doesn't change what it looks like." Tension spread quickly, not explosive, but heavy, like something building pressure beneath the surface of the ground. The bride stepped forward instinctively. He noticed immediately. "No," he said without looking back. But she didn't stop. "I'm not a prisoner," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard. The riders turned their attention to her now, surprised. The lead man narrowed his eyes. "You don't understand what you've stepped into." "I understand enough," she replied. The Apache's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. This was the first test, not of strength, but of perception. The lead rider pointed slightly toward him. "He doesn't belong with you, and you don't belong here." A long silence followed. The wind moved through the space between all of them, as if waiting for something to break. Then the Apache spoke. "Belonging is not something you are given by others," he said. "It is something you live into." The words were steady but firm. The lead rider shook his head. "Like words can fix what people see." He stepped closer. "And what we see is a man bringing trouble into a place that has already had enough." The tension sharpened. The bride felt it rising, the possibility of violence, misunderstanding, escalation. And then she did something unexpected. She walked fully outside. Not behind him, not beside him, but forward. The Apache turned slightly, as if to stop her again, but didn't. She stood between him and the riders. "I chose to be here," she said. The riders froze. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. The lead man frowned. "You don't know what you're defending." "I know I wasn't forced," she replied. "That's enough." Silence stretched. The Apache looked at her then, not surprised, but deeply focused, as if seeing a new layer of her he had not fully understood before. The lead rider exhaled sharply, frustration breaking through restraint. "This will end badly," he warned. The Apache stepped forward slightly, just enough that his presence aligned with hers, not behind her, not shielding her, but standing with her. "If it ends," he said calmly, "it will not be because of fear." That was enough. The riders hesitated. Something in the balance had shifted, not in dominance, but in certainty. There was no longer confusion about her place, no longer ambiguity about his restraint. After a tense pause, the lead rider signaled. "We'll be watching," he said. Then they turned and left, hooves kicking up wet earth as they disappeared into the distance. The silence they left behind was heavier than their arrival. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the bride finally exhaled. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she didn't step back. "I didn't want you to speak for me," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I didn't," he replied. "You spoke for yourself." That landed differently, because it was true. She had stepped forward without being told, without being protected, without being hidden. The Apache warrior studied her for a long moment. Then he said something quieter than everything before it. "You stayed." It wasn't a question. She nodded once. "Yes." A pause. "And I will not pretend that didn't matter," he added. The wind moved gently again, softer now, and for the first time, trust was no longer an idea between them. It was something that had been tested, strained, and still remained standing. Evening settled slowly over the plains, painting the sky in layers of deep amber and fading violet. The world outside the house felt calmer now, as if it had exhaled after the tension of the day. The wind still moved through the grass, but it no longer carried threat, only distance, memory, and the quiet rhythm of things continuing, despite everything that had happened. Inside the house, the fire burned steadily. The bride sat near it, her hands loosely resting in her lap. She wasn't thinking about the riders anymore. Their words had already begun to fade into something less sharp, less immediate. What remained instead was something harder to name, the awareness of what she had done, and what it meant that she had done it without being told. She had stepped forward, not as someone obeying, not as someone escaping, but as someone choosing. Across from her, the Apache warrior sat in his usual place near the fire. He was not watching her directly, but she could feel his awareness, subtle, steady, no longer distant in the way it had been when they first met. It was different now, less like observation, more like presence shared. The silence between them felt familiar now, but not empty. It held weight, but not pressure. Finally she spoke. "When you said, 'Stop me when it's too much,'" she began, then paused slightly, searching for the right words. "I didn't understand it at first." He didn't interrupt. She continued. "I thought it meant I was supposed to be afraid of what you might do, or that I needed permission to leave." Her eyes lifted briefly toward him. "But that's not what it was it?" He shook his head once. "No." A simple answer, no defense, no elaboration. That made it easier for her to continue. It was about respect, not control. He studied her for a moment, as if confirming that she truly understood. "Yes," he said. A pause stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was reflective. She leaned back slightly, exhaling. "No one has ever said something like that to me before," she admitted. "Not in a way that felt real." His gaze lowered slightly toward the fire. "Most people do not learn to speak that way," he said. "They learn to take, or to survive being taken from." Her expression tightened faintly, not in pain exactly, but in recognition. "That sounds familiar," she said. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the night deepened. For a long time, neither of them spoke again. Then he shifted slightly, resting his hands loosely together. "I did not expect you to stay," he said. She looked at him immediately. "I didn't expect to stay either," she replied honestly. A faint pause. "But I did," she added. That was when something subtle changed again, not in the room, but in the understanding between them. A line that had once been uncertain now felt more defined, not as ownership or obligation, but as shared acknowledgement. He nodded slowly. "And you did not do it because you were told," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." The silence that followed was different from all the others they had shared before. It was no longer filled with unknowns, but with recognition. He leaned back slightly, looking toward the fire. "Then you are not here by fate alone," he said. That word, fate, hung in the air for a moment. She considered it carefully. "I think I was brought here by fate," she said slowly, "but I stayed because I chose to understand what was in front of me." He glanced at her briefly. "And what is in front of you?" he asked. She hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because saying it aloud made it real. Finally she said, "A man who doesn't take what he isn't given, even when it would be easier to." That made him still. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he said quietly, "That is not what most people see." "I know," she replied, "but I am not most people." That earned the faintest shift in his expression, something like acknowledgement, but deeper. Not approval, not pride, something closer to understanding, being seen without distortion. He nodded once again, slower this time. "I do not ask for trust easily," he said, "and I do not give it without reason." She looked at him steadily. "Then don't give it easily," she said. "Give it when it's real." The words settled between them, like something placed carefully, not thrown. Outside, the wind moved gently across the plains. Inside, the firelight flickered across two people who had started this union as strangers, bound by circumstance, but who now sat in something far more fragile and far more meaningful. He finally spoke again, quieter than before. "Then, what do you call this?" he asked. She didn't hesitate this time. "Not fate anymore," she said. "Not survival either." A small pause. "Maybe beginning." The word felt strange in the air. Not heavy, not light, just true. He looked at her for a long time. Then, in a voice that carried neither command nor distance, he said, "Begin, then." And for the first time since she arrived, the bride did not feel placed inside a life she didn't choose. She felt inside one she was starting to shape.